This is the moment we've been waiting for. I don't think I've ever wanted, nay needed, to see an old man get punched as much as I do right now. The need is, ooh, it's strong. This chapter revealed Saint Saturn to be an extraordinarily sadistic mastermind with desires and tendencies somehow worse than even that of the average world noble. So that dude definitely needs a punching. First up though, we had 3 beautiful, much needed pages of closure with Bonnie. And seeing Bonnie apologize to Vegapunk was so tragically heartwarming, especially since she reverted to her actual form to do it. It makes it more genuine, more honest, and more emotionally vulnerable. And it also made me remember that Vegapunk is huge. In the panel of Bonnie as a little girl, the size difference makes sense, but then if you look at a shot of adult Bonnie and Vegapunk, he is a truly massive guy. But this explains Bonnie's light switch mood shift. Seeing Bonnie act so casual after the Egghead time skip led to all of these wacky theories about how it's actually Katarina Devon in disguise and such. But it turns out that flip happened quite early on. Bonnie saw the memory, she had a heartfelt cry, and this is very sad, but then recovered pretty immediately. Because as sad as learning all of this was, what Bonnie got out of this was the irrefutable proof that her father loved her all along and was thinking about her right up until the very last moment of his life. In many ways, what Bonnie just saw was a celebration of Kuma's life, as well as the inspiration to keep going and make a life for herself with this gift that Kuma gave her. Now, speaking of, Kuma also got Bonnie a tangible gift, which is a sun-shaped sapphire. And we need to talk about sapphires because they come back later on in this chapter in a far more twisted and frankly sickening capacity. But this gift is very classic Kuma. When Bonnie was a child, actually I suppose she still is, when Bonnie was a younger child, Kuma always encouraged her to be proud of her jewels. And that's the sole negative effect of getting rid of the sapphire scales. Bonnie loses the jewels that she was so proud of. And so Kuma made sure to supplement that with a replacement sapphire, which is sweet and everything, but my god, the very concept of this stone is a mixed blessing at best for Bonnie. Because we also have the revelation that it was Saint Saturn who gave Ginny the disease in the first place, which was passed on to Bonnie. Now, quite a few people did pretty much word for word call this, because as soon as the disease had a name, quite a few people were very quick to point out that the blue sapphire is the associated gemstone of the planet Saturn. And I'm not going to pretend to understand historically who, why, or how this connection was made between stone and planet, but it has to do with a particular brand of astrology. And regardless of my personal ignorance as a man on the internet, it's very clear that Oda is definitely aware and has used this as inspiration, especially since the necklace Kuma gave Bonnie is very in keeping with the astrologic, if that's how you say it, beliefs of what gemstones one should wear and when. But I do want to flag this. Sapphire scales and amber lead syndrome are very similar. Amber lead being the disease that Law and the rest of Flavance were infected with, which is also translated as white lead in English. And similarly, the white sapphire as well as diamonds and opals are associated with Venus. And in terms of the elder star, Saint Ethan Baron V. Nasjuro happens to be the warrior god of finance, aka the one who was more than likely in charge of overseeing Flavance's rise to affluence via the mining of white lead ore. And I'm not saying that Ethan created this disease, as it appears Saturn may have, but it's entirely possible that he allowed or even encouraged the entire kingdom to mine it, knowing its effects purely for the financial gain of the world government. And then when they found out, he had them exterminated. So after looking this up, Venus is also a planet that represents metal, and that's the thing that ore is. And I believe Saturn is Earth, which makes sense, sapphire scales turning the infected skin into hardened stone. So again, look, I'm not a huge fan of astrology, but it would appear that Oda might be, or at the very least he's very knowledgeable about the sector, because all of these connections are a bit too hard to ignore. And as for another connection that's incredibly difficult to ignore, this is the part of the video where we quite seriously need to ask, is Saint Saturn Jewelry Bonnie's biological father? It's a bit tricky because there are currently 3 translations floating around on the internet, all of which are kind of crap in their own fun and unique ways, and all of them are quite cryptic about Ginny's status as the 8th wife. For some context, we know that world nobles quite commonly have multiple wives that they cycle in and out at any given time, but what's particularly vague here is whether Saturn was referring to Ginny as his 8th wife. And at the moment, I'm inclined to say yes just because of what happens next. Looking at it from the perspective of the world nobles, and Saturn says as much in this chapter, they obviously don't view people as people, they're more like property. And within whatever sick world noble etiquette there is, would one world noble allow another one to experiment on their property? property? I would say not, because they just don't seem like the sharing type of people. But also, the conspiracy goes so much deeper. Remember that Kuma and Saturn had a bit of a chit-chat on God Valley before Kuma saved all of those people, no, it saved all of those properties, and whisked away to Sorbet. And Saint Saturn has never forgotten that moment, and he has never let it go. Saturn isn't just going to let the last surviving Buccaneer wander off and live in peace. Nah, because in Saturn's own words, Kuma was the descendant of a clan that once committed a grave crime against the world, the last survivor of the extinct Buccaneer people. So Saint Saturn doesn't just want Kuma dead, he wants Kuma to suffer for the crimes of his people. And the type of evil that Saint Saturn is the kind of guy to keep track of Kuma, and when he learns that one of Kuma's very close, how shall we say, intimate associates is Revolutionary Army member Ginny, then that leads Mr. Saturn to take a special interest in her. He abducts Ginny, he does unspeakable things to her, some of which he spoke about in this chapter, and he makes sure to release her with enough strength and life remaining to take that message back to Kuma. Because that's what it is, it's a message. Ginny's skin is riddled with sapphires, which we now know is kind of like Saint Saturn's signature, but that's only half the plan, because Ginny had a daughter which Saturn knew that Kuma would feel compelled to raise. And he would probably be happy with either outcome from here. Kuma would either have to watch his daughter die, which is lol, classic world noble prank right there, or Kuma would have to seek a cure, and Saturn knows that there is no cure because he created the thing, which would eventually lead Kuma straight into the wide open arms of the world government. Saturn didn't have to do anything, Kuma came to him. And in that moment of weakness that Saturn himself had created, Saturn struck a deal to have the last remaining Buccaneer completely hollowed out and placed in the service of the world government. I'm not saying that every step along the way was part of Saint Saturn's master plan, but he has expertly taken advantage of the situation at every step. And he may very well have had this long-term project designed just to torture Kuma as much as he could before killing him. And the reason why Saturn could be Bonnie's father becomes even more sickening, because if that is the case, then both of Bonnie's fathers would have given her sapphires, one as a gift, a protective charm, and the other as a curse, a thing designed to kill her to torture that guy. But as it turns out, that's not the only gift that Saturn gave to Bonnie. And I'm honestly thrilled to have a satisfying answer to this, because I was a bit taken aback when we didn't see Bonnie find and eat her devil fruit. I thought that was really weird, but it all makes sense now. I mean, I say all, there is still one thing I question, but it's very minor. Essentially though, Saturn has been Vegapunking, and was able to imbue Bonnie with a magical fruit power as a baby, without having her actually consume the fruit. So she's had this power almost from birth, which I think makes her the youngest devil fruit user in the series. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any others who ate a devil fruit as a baby, with the sole exception of Baby 5, but that's because of the name, not the age. This was definitely brought up in the chapter where Bonnie's powers manifested, but I remember questioning this possibility, because we do see an image of Kuma and Bonnie bathing, which from my perspective, Bonnie is half submerged in water, and devil fruit users are affected by being submerged in all water, not just seawater. So there's a little bit of a thing there. Doesn't matter, we're gonna let it go, because we also have some important clarification on Bonnie's actual abilities. Although this is another one that I think we do need to wait for the official translation to fully clear up. But as far as I understand it, Bonnie's powers allow her to transform or transform others into any future form that she perceives as possible. Which means that the only reason why this fruit is pretty shockingly overpowered is because it's being used by a child. And the more one comes to understand the reality of the world, the more limited the fruit's abilities become. Not even understand so much, but the more you come to accept reality. Which is why Bonnie's powers actively weaken in this chapter, because her belief in Nika wavers. Bonnie resigns herself to death, so she doesn't believe that anyone's coming to save her, not her father and not Nika. Which turns what was a previously devastating punch into more of a slap with a wet noodle. So it's a pretty cruel devil fruit actually, and I can definitely see why Saturn chose this ability to experiment with, because he and the world government seem to specialize in breaking people's spirits. So it's almost like giving someone a taste of ultimate freedom, only to break that spirit down and have the fruit respond accordingly by getting less and less powerful. And you know, if playing through 3 Danganronpa games has taught me anything, it's that maximum despair can only be achieved by offering a little shred of hope. And up until the end of this chapter, I think that Saturn has been extremely effective in administering despair. But something I'm very curious about in regards to Saturn is that he does the thing again. Right before the Kuma flashback started, Saturn was threatening to kill Bonnie, but ordered the Marines to do so by shooting her in the head. And other than, well, for funsies, I don't really see the reason why he needs to do this. Why can't Saturn just make Bonnie's head pop like that one Marine who was too curious for his own good? So is Saturn just insisting on a particularly morbid way to kill Bonnie? Or is it the idea that he, world nobleman, doesn't doesn't want to dirty himself with the squashing of insects? Or is there some special condition to do with his powers that prevents Saturn from exploding Bonnie for whatever reason that is? And if so, could that reason give us an opening? At first, I thought that Devil Fruit users might be immune from Saturn because the two people who do move in this chapter are Luffy and Bonnie. They both seem unaffected by the paralysis that everyone else is under, but then I realized that Vegapunk is also paralyzed and he's a fruit user, so yeah, there goes that idea. We do have to mention Luffy though, because there's a pretty big development that happened here incredibly sneakily. The first thing I want to say is that I really appreciate Luffy's role in this chapter, because overall it's a really heavy experience with a lot of dramatic revelations building tension, and by the end of the chapter that we'll get to, the promise of a release of said tension. But amongst all of that, we get Luffy acting like a goofball, begging for meat and then out of nowhere stuffing himself with food. And I think it was just the right amount of comedy to give readers the opportunity to take a breath and then return back to the seriousness. But we definitely do need to ask, who gave Luffy all that food? From the look of the burgers, fries, and cola, it looks like the food was made in the replicators that we saw very early on in the arc, and the people who we know who would know how to use those would be Luffy, Bonnie, Chopper, Jinbei, the Vegapunks, Kizaru. Actually, there's a lot of people who know how to use them. And you know what? Even if you didn't know how to use them, they're probably easy enough to just press and play. But most of those people can be ruled out because they're either not there, or if they are there, they're paralyzed. So here's my initial thinking. Maybe, just maybe, good old beloved Swamp Nakama has come through for us once again. Just like he did on Wano, he hoarded an entire banquet within his swampy innards, and knowing that this island is surrounded by marines, Caribou knows that there's only one way out, which is to feed Luffy. Because if it worked against Kaido, then surely it can work against an Elder Star. And also because Caribou is sneaky, very sneaky, and with his swampedness, he has known to evade detection before. So while everyone's looking up there, focusing on Saturn and Bonnie, Caribou from behind, he slithers in, dumps a pile of food, and then slithers back out. And at the moment, one of the only other reasonable options I can think of is that Luffy's Nika powers have become so insane that he can literally imagine food into existence, which I think would be the final step in making Luffy far, far too overpowered, because he then becomes self-sustaining. Now, the other option is Kizaru. In this chapter, I do think he's implicated as a culprit through the power of juxtaposition. We see Luffy eating, stuffing himself, and then we cut to a panel of Kizaru sitting there with a thought bubble thinking of nothing. Sort of like I don't know who could have done this, it certainly wasn't me. And fair enough, because the dude can move at effectively light speed, and Kizaru does show some sympathy for Bonnie and Sentomaru in this chapter, and that could even be the beginning of Kizaru flipping on Egghead Island and heading towards some redemption. I mean, after the Kuma flashback, I'm no longer sold that Kizaru is going to stick to his duty. I think there definitely is the potential for him to flip, but as fast as his powers are, they aren't particularly subtle. It's a pretty big deal every time Kizaru makes a move, and also he wouldn't necessarily know or understand the impact that food has on Luffy. The way I interpret this panel is more like Kizaru saw who gave Luffy food and decided not to say or do anything about it. But again, this was a bit of fun and a good chance to breathe, because I definitely needed it, as immediately after, Bonnie had a full-on breakdown over the next couple of pages. Bonnie very much comes to terms with what she's up against, deems it impossible to overcome, and thinks that it would have been better if she'd just died. Because everything that happened to Kuma, well, not everything, but a lot of the things that happened to Kuma were all for her. And the fact that she's going to die here makes all of that sacrifice pointless from her perspective. It gave me a wave of nostalgia back to the Enies Lobby era, because Bonnie saying that it would have been better for her to die reminds me a lot of Robin's resignation to death, because she viewed it as both inevitable and the best outcome for the Straw Hats to be saved. Or like Nami's moment where she feels so powerless that all she can do is stab her tattoo. And knowing that Bonnie is only 12 makes all of this that much more potent. To push a 12-year-old into believing that it would have been better if she was dead is a whole different sphere of evil. And it also takes me back more recently to chapter 1095, which was actually titled Better Off Dead in This World, where Kuma's father said that his mother was better off dead. A memory which Bonnie saw and may have even informed her own thoughts here. But then the moment that we've been waiting for does finally arrive, and it was so incredibly satisfying to see Kuma finally reunite with Bonnie. In fact, those last 2 pages might be my favorite 2 pages of the year. And a lot of you probably noticed this, but the way Oda drew Kuma saving Bonnie is very much with the same positioning as the iconic moment where Ace sacrificed himself to save Luffy. 2 great martyrs being struck and, dare I say, penetrated from behind. But the beautiful part of this is that we then get something that we didn't with Ace. Because imagine if after that Ace just turned around and clobbered Sakazuki. That's what appears to be happening here with Kuma. Although honestly, I'm kind of annoyed that Oda would deny us the satisfaction of seeing the punch in this chapter. It's like, Oda, mate, We end with Saturn's face about to be punched, and it's such a blue balls moment. Oda builds everything up to this and says, "Welp, see you guys next year." But the really cool thing is that we also confirm that Kuma is a haki user. He doesn't have either of his gloves on, so this darkened hand is definitely armament haki, which is a much bigger deal than usual, because haki is of course a manifestation of willpower. So I guess the biggest revelation in this chapter is that Bartholomew Kuma is not dead. And I mean, don't get too excited, because I don't know exactly how much of him still exists. It's probably not much, but there's something there. At the very least, it's enough to have willpower. And that second last panel of Kuma is my favorite of the chapter. I love how Oda creates the sense of overwhelming power about to strike through the intentionally sketchy line work. And when it comes to the character, I love that he drew Kuma with his teeth grit, which seems like a minor thing, but that is such a human thing to do. And it reminds me of the panel from chapter 1099 when Kuma had to stop Bakori by performing the legendary one-man revolution. We saw him there with his teeth grit in sheer fury. The angriest we'd ever seen Kuma up until this chapter where he does it again. And there's also an even more raw sense of anger due to the type of attack that Kuma's going for. Because with Bakori, Kuma attacked him with an open palm, but with Saturn, it's a fist. Kuma is not using his powers and he's not fighting intelligently. What he's doing is seemingly for the first time in his life, taking out his raw anger on someone. Although in a way, this does make his story that much more tragic. The idea that some of Kuma is still clearly in there, and the thought that he's endured life beyond the cyborg process, and that part of him may have been aware of how the world nobles were using him on Marijois. But whatever the case, this is one hell of a way to cap off 2023, and it seems like 2024 is going to begin with a punch that may rival or even surpass the likes of Bellamy or St. Charles.